April 1961, the CIA, with the help of the Mafia, pursues a series of plots to poison or shoot Castro. The CIA's own internal report on these efforts states that these plots were viewed by at least some or of the participants as being merely one aspect of the overall active effort to overthrow the regime that culminated in the Bay of Pigs, and this whole operation called Operation Mongoose. The Miami Herald considered publishing a story at the time by David Kraslow about CIA training of Cuban exiles near Homestead, Florida, which is a great little kind of side scene that if you, in The Irishman, if you missed it, Franks gets this weird job where he has to drive down these heavy military equipment to some weird place in Florida. Like, what's that all about, you may have been wondering. Well, yeah, this is kind of what was going on there at the time. They were training, getting very much prepared to launch this ill-fated mission. The story reports the Justice and State Departments are unhappy about the violation of the Neutrality Act and are pressuring Eisenhower to move all such CIA training operations, and that exiles are to be sent into Cuba to wage guerrilla war against Castro. After meeting with Allen Dulles and being informed that the publication would be most harmful to the national interest, the paper's editors decide to not print the story. So they're getting hit there with the old, it's in the best interest of national security kind of effect there. The CIA then hired a small public relations firm, Lem Jones Associates Incorporated, to handle official announcements by the exile groups involved in the Cuban project, which, again, the whole point of this was here to make them appear as disassociated as possible from anything to do with the CIA and the fingerprints of the American state. So they kind of go back and forth, arresting people, shooting them down, and kind of just back and forth, tit for tat, with America picking up scalps against some Cubans, and Cubans picking up some scalps against Americans, and Castro is really focused about getting scalps that he knows matter to the U.S. most, saying, quote, and a pretty badass quote in my opinion, "If they continue the economic aggression against our country, we will continue nationalizing U.S. businesses," really hitting them where they hurt. And that's the economic aggression of the U.S. It's not sanctioning the country per se, but really what it takes most aggressively is that attack on what is the main backbone of what makes America America, which is big business interests and how they are oftentimes in such deep government collaboration. As you may be aware, at this point in our country's history, our nation in the run-up to the 1960s election had a totally healthy and very diverse conversation about foreign policy and communism and the Red Menace, with, get this, John F. Kennedy attacking Dwight D. Eisenhower for not being bullish enough and more aggressive on the Cuban threat, saying, "My opponent has allowed a communist menace to..." I'm being British. I'm turning into British. I can't do John F. Kennedy. He says, "My opponent has allowed a communist menace to arise 90 miles from our shores." So disturbing, pulling the old Republican line, classic Republican line of the recent vintage. "If you can't stand up to Castro, how can you be expected to stand up to Khrushchev?" And 5 days later, he said, quote, "We must attempt to strengthen our non-Batista democratic anti-Castro forces in exile and in Cuba itself, who offer eventual hope of overthrowing Castro. Thus far, these fighters for freedom have had virtually no support from our government," which is really quite an interesting way of looking at it. And, of course, to clarify here, Eisenhower, 2 terms, he's not running for re-election, and the Republican nominee at this time is Richard Nixon. He was fully aware of the anti-Castro activities taking place and being planned, and attacks on Kennedy's position on Cuba, or he attacked Kennedy's position on Cuba as irresponsible and reckless. Nixon argued that if the United States were to back the Cuban exiles, it would be condemned to the United Nations and would not accomplish our objective. It seems almost cute to see, of all people, Richard Nixon bringing up the United States being condemned in the United Nations based on the point that we are now in U.S. foreign policy, and how 30 years later, what the United States would do in the wake of in the lead up to the war in Iraq with the United Nations. That was it's a little funny one. So we continue to see the kind of back and forth of war, and at this time also, Raul Roa, Cuba's foreign minister, denounced what he picked up from intelligence services, Cuban intelligence services, as possible plans of invasion by the United States, and pretty much called it right on. He was like, yeah, there's some guy, Robert Alejos, brother of Guatemalan ambassador to the U.S., numerous exiles and adventurers are receiving training under the command of North American military men in this island. He was like, yeah, this is going to happen. And he pretty much, even Fidel and also the Russians knew of this attack at a time. Meanwhile, the Cuban government was out nationalizing 382 big businesses, including manufacturers of sugar, liquor, beer, perfume, soap, textiles, milk products, as well as banks. And it was, things were just getting intense. So right around the end of October, the press officer for the Guatemalan president admitted that there were military personnel in more than 25 fincas in the country, but denied that they're related to the invasion of Cuba. Their purpose is to respond to any eventual attack from the Fidelista guerrillas. Little did they know that the reverse would soon be much more of a threat there, obviously. A Guatemalan newspaper, La Hora, publishes a story disclosing the CIA has built a heavily guarded $1 million base near Retalhulu, I'm just going to say that, to train Cuban counter-revolutionaries for landing in Cuba. So pretty much getting the story right there months and months, actually, before this was actually set to take place. And a cable from the CIA headquarters to senior agency officers in Guatemala outlined the plan for the amphibious invasion of Cuba by assault force of at least 1,500 men who would receive conventional military training. President Eisenhower pressed CIA Director Dulles around November about the missing Cuban government in exile. Dulles really throughout this failed to deliver, and pretty much what he did was kind of play his different sources of power and kind of lead them along, string them along, like, oh, we're working on it. We're gonna get that government in exile. We're gonna get that government in waiting right up for you, President Eisenhower. President Kennedy, we will do great without the air support. Yeah, just send it if you want. I don't know. Maybe you don't want to send it. It's fine. The entire invasion, the entire fate of the invasion doesn't completely depend on it. No. Why would you say that? Of course, it did. But in Guatemala, there was some trouble for the plotters. A major grievance is the presence of the CIA, as young officers revolted in the coup plotting camp. Directed by Cuban expeditionary forces in Guatemala, President Idroguez calls for U.S. aid in putting down the rebellion, and brigade planes strafe the rebels, helping to put down the rebellion. Guatemalan friends, quote-unquote, of the Cuban Revolution, supply intelligence to the Castro government on the activities of Cuban exiles in Guatemala. A 6-page intelligence report records the buildup of exile forces over the previous summer and the type of aircraft being used, location of the training bases. So they pretty much had all of them dead to rights on this. The Nation magazine, around November 19th, printed an editorial, "Are we training Cuban guerrillas? Interesting." And following a query from a reader, the New York Times instructs its Central America correspondent, Paul P. Kennedy, to look into the story of the CIA training Cuban exiles in Guatemala. So, literally, the New York Times get this idea from a reader, but hey, maybe there may be something possibly worth checking out that our government is doing down in Central America, like maybe trying to overthrow someone else's government. All right, we are getting close to the turn now to 1961. You know what? We can pretty much just, you know what? We'll tell you what is going on. And pretty much what happens is they're purchasing, the CIA is just purchasing more and more military equipment. They're building things up in Guatemala. Meanwhile, in a speech, Fidel Castro announced the imperialist plan to invade Cuba, pretty much, again, calling this out, knowing that the forces of imperialism were closing in all around him. His attempts to focus world attention on the danger our country is running, and declares that Cuba will mobilize people and adopt such measures as can persuade the imperialists that it will not be a military cakewalk. Castro warns the United States, if they want to invade us and destroy the resistance, they will not succeed, because as long as a single man or woman with honor remains, there will be resistance. Castro predicts that a few thousand paratroops with some boats will not take the capital or any major cities, and that they will need many more troops, and that they will pay a heavier price than in the landings in Normandy and Okinawa. So talking real soft there in December 30th, 1960 there. Just, a year in office now? No. Well, yeah. So it is, he is absolutely, I really think what Nixon said there was one of the best calls about him. Like, he could tell right away that this guy, he has the quality. He's a leader of men. And you could tell that stepping in very, very early on, he had the grip on in this country. It certainly laxed a little bit with age, but at this time, early 1960s, throughout the 60s, really, he was locked in a battle with the U.S. imperial state. That just really was fascinating to watch, and I do want to focus a little bit more of the season about it, because there are so many stories just beyond the lead up to here, the Bay of Pigs. But as we turn into January of 1961, of course, Kennedy now at this point is president-elect, and things are getting serious. The Cuban Ministry of Foreign Relations in Havana sent a telegram to the U.S. Embassy informing that the total member of personnel at the U.S. Embassy and consulate should not exceed 11 people. Further, U.S. government personnel must abandon the national territory of Cuba within 48 hours of the receipt of the telegram. President Eisenhower met with his advisors at 9:30 a.m. the next morning to discuss what steps to take, including the break of diplomatic relations in response to Cuba's demand that official representation be cut to 11 people. Turning to discussion of planning covert action against Cuba, Gordon Gray, quoted describing Cuban exiles in training as the best army in Latin America, baby, woohoo! And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Lemnitzer, heartily agreed. Gordon Gray was a national security official in the Eisenhower administration. During the meeting, Eisenhower offers that he would move against Castro before the 20th of January, of course, his last day in office, if the Cubans provided him with a really good excuse. Failing that, he says, perhaps the U.S. could think of manufacturing something that would be generally acceptable, remember the Maine, something like that, maybe. At 8:30 p.m., because it would be really a same place, literally the same thing, in the same place, something similar to that, but obviously they would not be able to figure it out. Fidel Castro announces that Cuba will go to the UN and declared that if the United States believes it has the right to promote counter-revolution in Cuba and believes it has the right to promote counter-revolution in reaction to Latin America, well, Cuba has the right to encourage revolution in Latin America. So they will play that game too. Two can play the game, says Fidel Castro, really in a incredibly bold way, unlike anyone has ever done before. I think at this point, stand up to the United States in their own backyard, actively encouraging these kind of revolutions in support of the kind of communist socialist cause against what was the overbearing capitalist cause in a sea of capitalist victories in the Cold War period. On the same day, Manuel Artime, remember him, met in Miami with Marcos Valdez Castilla, the exile representative of the Union Revolucionaria Anticomunista. The two signed a unity pact, and the URI officers offered recognition of the FRD's civilian leadership of resistance forces and agrees that Artime will represent them on the FRD executive committee. So they got that little political arrangement sorted out. But meanwhile, the real heads over the CIA were plotting away, preparing a memorandum to outline the status of preparation for the conduct of amphibious, airborne, and tactical operations to be carried out. Very, very exciting. Key date worth marking now, January 28th, 1961. Now President Kennedy received his first briefing as president on the Cuban operation in a meeting attended by Lyndon B. Johnson, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, CIA Director Dulles, General Lemnitzer, Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Assistant Secretaries Amanda Neitz and Tracy Parnes of the CIA. After hearing the estimate of the Defense Department that no course of action currently authorized by the United States government will be effective in reaching the agreed national goal of overthrowing the Castro regime, the State Department's view that any overt military action not authorized and supported by the Organization of American States will have grave political dangers. Kennedy decides a continuation and accentuation of current activity